She was begin in a scarecrow. 2 years after she disappeared, her bones, intertwined with rotten straw, stood on a board cantankerous in the average of a vast cornfield in Virginia. This adventure is not about the agrarian nature of the Appalachian Isle and its dangers. It's about a monster who lived in apparent sight, bouncing at casual cars and staring every day at his horrific creation, which he alleged a scarecrow. It all began in the summer of 2005. For 24-year-old Sarah Jenkins of Columbus, Ohio, it was declared to be the summer of her life. She had just graduated from academy with a Mount in journalism and afford diving into adult life with an appointment job and a mortgage, decided to accomplish her constant dream of hiking a cogent allocation of the Appalachian Isle alone. Sarah was not a professional hiker, but she was well prepared. She spent months researching routes, annual blogs and books by accomplished hikers, and buying equipment. She was strong, independent, and abounding of optimism. Her parents were worried, of course, but they were proud of their daughter's determination. To them, she was their bright, adventurous child who consistently got what she wanted. Sarah ran a baby but accepted biking blog called Sarah Sees the World. Breath she planned to certificate every footfall of her adventure with autograph and photos. In early June 2005, she said goodbye to her family and flew to Georgia, the starting point of her journey. The aboriginal weeks of the haversack were absolutely as she had dreamed. She absolved north, passing through abutting forests, climbing picturesque peaks, and a fair fellow travelers forth the way. Her blog was updated regularly. She wrote about the beauty of nature, the difficulties of long journeys, and the affection of strangers, the angels of the Isle who helped tourists with aliment and shelter. Her photos conveyed the amplitude of the mountains and her own faculty of freedom and happiness. She consistently alleged her parents from the baby town's breadth she stopped to restock her supplies. The aftermost time they battened to her was at the end of July. She was in Virginia, had already absolved added than 1,000 kilometers, and was activity great. She was abounding of enthusiasm and said that the next section of the Isle was excellent, albeit absolutely secluded. The aftermost access in her blog was Anachronous July 28, 2005. It was a quaint from an internet bistro in the baby boondocks of Daleville, Virginia. In it, Sarah humorously declared her struggle with blisters and her dreams of an absolute cheeseburger. She wrote that she was entering one of the wildest genitalia of the Isle and that her abutting opportunity to get in blow would allegedly be in a week or 10 days. She concluded the column with the words, "The mountains are calling and I accept to go. Don't lose me." Those were her aftermost appear words. Back 10 days anesthetized and there was no chat from Sarah, her parents began to worry. When 2 weeks passed, they articulate the alarm. They contacted the Appalachian Trail Association and bounded police. A search operation began immediately. Dozens of rangers, badge officers, and volunteers, abounding of them experienced hikers, began combing the breadth of the trail. Sarah was believed to have gone missing. The chase was arduous. This breadth of the Appalachian is hundreds of above-board distant of abutting forest, rocky cliffs, and abysmal gorges. The Isle is just a attenuate cilia in this vast wilderness. Searchers arrested every cabin and apartment forth the way. In the log book of one of the shelters, they found her aftermost access allegedly fabricated on July 29th or 30. A abbreviated agenda about the weather and the signature Sarah J. After that, her Isle went cold. The police questioned added tourists who might accept been in the breadth at the same time. Some remembered an abandoned babe who looked like Sarah, but no one could say anything definite. There are abounding people on the trail, and faces are quickly forgotten. Canicule angry into weeks. Search parties combed every inch of the official avenue and the surrounding area. Helicopters surveyed the breadth from the air, but annihilation was found. Not her bright red backpack, not her tent, not her camera. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that she had labored the trail. It was as if an accomplished and well-trained babe had vanished on a well-marked route. All possibilities were considered. An accident, but in that case, they would best acceptable have found anatomy or equipment. An advance by our agrarian animal? Highly cool in this area, and again, there would accept been traces. Kidnapping. This adaptation seemed the best frightening and the best realistic. Someone could have tracked bottomward a abandoned babe and taken her off the trail. Ages passed, then another. The all-embracing search operation was acutely alleged off. Sarah's parents, addled with grief, spent all their accumulation on private investigators, but alike they couldn't find any leads. Sarah Jenkins's story made Civic Annual for a while. Still then, as always, it was replaced by other, added contempo tragedies. To the world, her adventure became just another baffling abstruseness of the Appalachian Trail, a cautionary tale that tourists sometimes told anniversary other around the campfire. But for her family and friends, the affliction never went away. The blank larboard abaft afterwards her disappearance was unbearable. For 2 years, they lived in agonizing uncertainty. And none of them could accept imagined that the acknowledgement to their questions had been there all along. Not in the remote forest, not in the Abundance Gorge, but just a brace of distant from the isle on an old acreage breadth an animal scarecrow stood in the average of a cornfield, staring with abandoned button eyes at the hikers casual by. 2 years passed. It was August 2007. Summer in the Shenandoah Valley was advancing to an end, painting the hills in abysmal shades of green and gold. The blah in the field stood alpine and thick, cat and mouse to be harvested. Activity in this rural allotment of Virginia flowed, as arid as it always had. The adventure of the ambler who disappeared on the isle became a local legend, a sad admonition that the wilderness, which continued out nearby, did not absolve mistakes. Farmers formed their acreage, and one of them was Silas Blackwood, a 70-year-old man whose acreage belted the national forest. He was a local. His ancestors had owned the acreage for generations. Neighbors who lived a mile abroad knew him as a quiet and aloof widower. His wife had died 20 years ago, and his only babe had continued aback, confused to the added ancillary of the country, and rarely visited her father. Silas was one of those bodies who seemed to accept grown into the land. He hardly went to town, hardly battened to anyone, and spent his days on his farm. Bodies advised him a controllable eccentric. Every bounce he would abode a bother in the centermost of his primary field, and there was nothing unusual about that. But for the accomplished 2 years, his bother had been strange. It was disproportionately large, somehow misshapen and dense. Its accoutrement was also unusual. Not old farmers' overalls, but achromatic women's pants that looked like hiking pants and an arid synthetic jacket. But no one paid any absorption to it. Who knows what affectionate of clutter an older man would put on a board cross. The denim came in the aftermost anniversary of August. A powerful summer storm hit the region. It rained heavily for several hours, and the wind seemed to be aggravating to uproot the age-old oak trees. The abutting morning, when the storm subsided, the entire valley looked ravaged. Burst branches littered the anchorage, and the blah fields were flattened. One of Silas's neighbors, Jim, was driving his auto barter to appraise the damage to his crops. His avenue took him past the Blackwood farm. As he drove past the cornfield, he noticed that the older man's acclaimed bother had not survived the storm. It was burst at the base and lay on the arena in a muddy puddle. One of the accoutrements had burst off, and the accomplished anatomy had collapsed. But that wasn't what angled Jim's attention. Article white and smooth, not at all like straw, was a frayed out of the burst burlap that served as the scarecrow's body. Jim chock-full the auto on the ancillary of the road. Curiosity overcame his desire to get on with his business. He got out of the car and aggressive over a low fence, absolved above the acreage toward the collapsed scarecrow. As he got closer, he smelled a abreast but awful sweetish odor. He angled bottomward and pushed abreast the wet, adulteration straw. What he saw fabricated him recoil and scream. A animal skull stared back at him from the rags. Added bones lay nearby, alloyed with mud and debris of clothing. Jim, apathy about his crops, rushed back to his car. His hands were afraid so acutely that he could barely punch 911. 20 annual later, sheriff's cars pulled up to Silas Blackwood's farm. The older man met them on the balustrade of his dilapidated house, captivation a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked calm, even hardly affronted that his morning solitude had been disturbed. While the accumulation cordoned off the field and the afterimage of the abominable discovery, the sheriff began talking to Blackwood. The earlier man answered questions about the bother arid and calmly. Yes, it scared him. The storm bankrupted it. It happens. What's inside? He shrugged. Straw, old rags, whatever I could find. He said it with such alienation that a chill ran bottomward the accomplished sheriff's spine. He accomplished that this man was either the best amateur in the apple or a complete psychopath. While this conversation was activity on, forensic experts were already alive in the field. The armpit was gruesome. The scarecrow was absolutely blimp with human remains. The basic were burst and mixed with harbinger to accord the anatomy volume and shape. Among the bones, experts found debris of fabric, the same synthetic anorak that had been on the Scarecrow. And in the mud beneath the broken torso, they saw what would become one of the key pieces of evidence: a heavy hiking Cossack abstemious assimilate the remains of an animal ankle. The case immediately became an antecedent for the Canton police. It didn't booty the sheriff continued to remember a baffling case from 2 years earlier. The missing day tripper was Sarah Jenkins. She had abolished on the section of the aisle that ran aloof a couple of distant from Blackwood's farm through the woods, adjoining to his property. The likelihood that this was a mere accompaniment was zero. The 2-year-old alleged case aback became the best high-profile case in the history of their county. Silas Blackwood was arrested that aforementioned day as a person of interest. He didn't resist. He silently accustomed himself to be handcuffed and got into the convoying car. During his aboriginal interrogation, he behaved in the aforementioned way, bashful and staring at a distinct point, occasionally repeating his adaptation of contest that he had begun the basic in the dupe and decided to actuate of them so that no one would see them. He claimed that he was afraid and didn't apperceive what to do. But his adventure was abounding of holes. No one believed a chat, he said. While he was denying aggregate in the interrogation room, an all-encompassing chase began on his farm to bear what added secrets this quiet, abandoned bend of rural America was hiding. The board were confident that they would acquisition answers to all their questions there. While forensic experts were acrimonious distant the gruesome capacity of the bother on Blackwood's farm, Silas himself sat in a sterile claiming allowance in the sheriff's office. He looked like a stone. Hour afterwards hour, detectives tried to breach through his bank of silence, but he aloof again his cool story. I found it in the woods. I was scared. I hid it. He said it monotonously without emotion, staring at his callous, age-potted hands. His calmness was unnatural and frightening. He didn't act like a abashed earlier man who had stumbled into trouble. He behaved like a man who had a plan for this situation and was absolutely afterward it. The detectives accomplished that after solid evidence, they would not be able to get him to talk. All their hopes adequate on the aggregation administering the chase of his farm. Blackwood's acreage was a time capsule. The abode breadth he was built in and raised seemed Banosic for the aftermost 50 years. Aggregate was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was filled with the aged aroma of age and loneliness. The badge absolutely combed through this athenaeum of activity continued gone. Room by room, they pried up floors, checked walls, and went through the contents of every drawer. Best of what they begin was aloof junk, old newspapers, burst tools, his late wife's clothes. Neatly bankrupt in trunks. Several hours of analytic yielded no results accordant to the case. But the investigators knew that murderers often keep trophies, items that accord to their victims, and they were abiding that Silas was no exception. The breakthrough came in an old battered barn where Blackwood kept his acreage equipment. In the far corner, beneath the accumulation of rusty chains and old tires, one of the officers stumbled aloft an old army box locked with an ample padlock. The lock was bound sawed off. Back the lid of the box was opened. Anybody realized that the chase was over. Inside, neatly wrapped in burlap, lay a blaze red hiking backpack. It was dirty but otherwise intact. With abashed hands, the argumentative Abel began to abolish the contents. There was a sleeping bag, a small anthology that had served as Sarah's diary, a map of the Appalachian Trail with addendum accounting in her hand, and best importantly, an agenda camera in a careful case. It was her camera, the actual one she had acclimated to take pictures for her blog. The acquisition was immediately taken to the station. While the experts were analytical the camera, the sheriff ordered Sarah's annual to be brought to the claiming room. He placed it on the table in advance of Silas. "Does this attending accustom to you, Mr. Blackwood?" The earlier man glanced at the notebook and stared at the table again without adage a word, but the detectives noticed a beef beat on his audacity for a second. Meanwhile, forensic experts in the lab confirmed what was already obvious. Comparing Sarah Jenkins' dental records sent from Ohio with the anatomy of the jaw begin in the Scarecrow, they gave a 100% conclusion. The charcoal belonged to her. The missing being case was officially bankrupt and a murder investigation was opened. But the real blow for Silas Blackwood came from the memory agenda in Sarah's camera. Experts had no agitation retrieving all the files from it. There were several hundred photos on the card. The Aboriginal ones were taken in Georgia and Tennessee. Picturesque landscapes, selfies of a smiling Sarah adjoin the accomplishments of mountains, and pictures of other tourists she had met forth the way. Looking through them, the detectives felt as if they were retracing her last journey, seeing the apple through her eyes. The afterpiece they got to the end, the more photos of Virginia's forests there were. Here were the aftermost peaceful shots. A stream abounding through rocks, a deer stepping assimilate a trail, her own tent pitched at sunset, and again came the last bristles photos. These bristles frames were different from all the others. They were blurred, taken in agitation from close range. The aboriginal showed a man's plaid shirt. The additional was a bleared advance of the arena and someone's boots. The last three were the best terrifying. It was a face, the face of a man angled with rage, staring beeline into the camera. Despite the poor affection and the shaking of the camera, the photos acutely showed Silas Blackwood, a little adolescent than he was now, but it was him. In the last moments of her life, in a desperate struggle, Sarah did what she did best. She accurate the truth. She photographed her killer. The sheriff entered the interrogation room, captivation ample printed photographs in his hands. He sat bottomward silently opposite Silas and placed the first photograph on the table. It was Blackwood's face taken by Sarah. The older man looked at the photo and his body tensed for the aboriginal time during the absolute interrogation. The sheriff placed the additional photo abutting to it, then the third. He said nothing, aloof stared at Silas. The earlier man's stony expression began to crack. His lips trembled. He was attractive at his own face, captured at the moment he committed an aberrant crime. The silence in the allowance became deafening. And then, after several annual of this silent standoff, Silas Blackwood looked up at the sheriff. The bank came crashing down. In articulation as quiet and age-old as an unlubricated door, he accurate his first accurate words in 2 years. It was hot that day. Actual hot. With these words, Silas Blackwood's confession began. And the added he batten in his quiet, achromatic voice, the more terrifying the annual of that July day in 2005 became. He fabricated no advance to justify himself and showed no remorse. He declared the facts as if he were talking about burying blah or repairing a fence. That day, as usual, he was working at the far end of his property, which belted the forest. He generally saw tourists walking forth the trail, bright spots adjoin the blooming backdrop. He despised them. To him, they were strangers, intruders into his secluded world, blessed and airy bodies from a life that had continued aback concluded for him. When he saw Sarah, she had larboard the main trail and was walking forth an old overgrown aisle that led to a beck on his land. She allegedly capital to get some baptize or ablution her face. He said there was article about her that drove him crazy. Her youth, her confidence, her ablaze red backpack. In his sick, loneliness berserk mind, she became a symbol of aggregate he had absent and hated. It wasn't a planned action. It was authentic bloodthirsty impulse. He waited for her, ambuscade abaft the trees. When she angled bottomward to the stream, he attacked. He told her about her desperate resistance. She was able and fought angrily for her life. It was at that moment, as he approved to battle the camera from her neck, that she took the pictures. It was chaos, screams that no one could hear, and the beat of the camera shutter. He raped her. And then when he accomplished that she had apparent his face and would be able to analyze him, he deadened her. He anecdotal all of this with an alarming detachment. After the murder, he abject her body into blubbery blackberry bushes on his land, alive that chase parties would never access clandestine property. He took the haversack with him and hid it in a shed. He alternate home, done himself, and formed in the fields for the blow of the day as if annihilation had happened. The best abominable allotment of his confession concerned the Scarecrow. He said that the abstraction didn't appear to him appropriate away. Sarah's anatomy lay in the bushes all winter, hidden beneath the snow. In the spring, back it was time to adapt the field for planting, he absentively that he didn't appetite to coffin the bones. That seemed too simple and arid to him. He wanted, in his words, to accumulate her close. It was his askance way of maintaining control, his abhorrent secret, which was both hidden and on affectation for all to see. At night, he aggregate what was left of Sarah into a bag. Then, by moonlight in his barn, he congenital a new scarecrow. He alloyed her basic with straw, stretched burlap over a board cross, and dressed his conception in her traveling clothes. For him, it was the ultimate act of humiliation and power. Every day for almost 2 years, he looked out the window at this scarecrow. He saw other tourists bouncing at him from afar, mistaking him for an accustomed farmer. And none of them knew that they were greeting not alone a murderer, but also his victim. The balloon of Silas Blackwood was quick. Given his abounding confession backed up by actual evidence, Sarah's diary and camera, as able-bodied as DNA test results, the Aegis had about no chance. The attorneys approved to prove his insanity, citation senile dementia, and the furnishings of continued amusing isolation. But the prosecutor presented his confession to the court, a cold, methodical, and abundant annual that could not accept a peer from a man unaware of his actions. And back the board was apparent the last photos taken by Sarah. Abundant silence fell over the courtroom. These blurry, panicked images were the most substantial affirmation for the prosecution. It was Sarah herself speaking from above the grave, pointing to her killer. Silas Blackwood was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. The adjudicator annual the sentence called his accomplishments an act of absolute evil above animal comprehension. He was sentenced to activity in Bastille after the possibility of parole. For Sarah's parents, the adjudication was the end of a long nightmare, but it brought no relief. They knew the truth, but that truth was unbearable. At the trial, her father said that they would consistently be proud of their daughter's aftermost act. Even in the face of death, she remained a journalist and did aggregate she could to ensure that her analgesic was found. The news that the quiet agriculturalist Blackwood was a monster abashed the bounded community. People had lived abutting to him for years and had no abstraction of the black that lurked abaft his bashful facade. Silas Blackwood died in a best security prison 7 years afterwards of an affection attack. His acreage was awash and his old abode and barns were burst down. The new owner plowed the cornfield, abatement all traces of this abhorrent adventure from the face of the earth. But it remained. Sarah Jenkins set out on a haversack to acquaint the world about the adorableness of the Appalachian Trail. In the end, at the cost of her life, she said a completely different, alarming story. A story about a bother that was not aloof a scarecrow.